How are you doing, everyone? Welcome back to Dr. B Teaches and the 7th Generation Podcast. I'm your host of the show, Dr. B. In today's episode, we're going to talk about a comment that I get quite a bit. Whenever I talk about Indigenous issues and history, settler colonialism, colonization, I'll often get responses such as, "Stop blaming Europeans for conquering you all. Quit living in the past." Or Native Americans were killing each other long before Europeans ever landed in the Western Hemisphere. Those lines show up quite a bit in the comment section. So in today's show, we're going to pull apart piece by piece this settler colonial empire building logic. And if you're new to the show, my name is Dr. B. I'm a sociology professor. I talk about history, Indigenous issues without sugarcoating it. All right, so today's roadmap is pretty simple. We're going to discuss why everybody was conquering everybody is a false equivalency when we're talking about Native American warfare and conflict and settler colonialism. It's a false equivalency. We're going to discuss that. And we're also going to talk about the scale, the intent, and the structure of settler colonialism here in the Americas, and how settler colonialism is about the elimination of Indigenous peoples. It's about the destruction of Indigenous cultures. And through that process, genocide is committed and has been committed. And we're going to talk about that as well. Also, we're going to talk about how the structure of settler colonialism, whether it's the current political climate or the legal system, all of that still shapes and impacts the lives of Indigenous peoples today. So what people think happened in the past is still with us here today in 2025. And also it's a call to action for our allies who need some type of response to people, to friends, family members who might be feeding them the same lines of nonsense. So hopefully today our allies will have something to work with when they're talking with family, friends, and co-workers and whoever else says this type of nonsense. All right, let's start with the false equivalency that Native Americans were conquering and unaliving each other long before Europeans ever arrived here. So when Europeans came here, they were basically doing to Native Americans what Native Americans had been doing to themselves long before Europeans arrived in 1492. Again, this is a false equivalency. I'm going to explain why. Conflict is universal, absolutely. Groups will go to war with one another. We've seen this throughout history. This happens quite a bit between groups, and it happened here in pre-invasion America. So prior to 1492, absolutely, Native Americans fought with one another. And here's the most important thing to keep in mind is that Native Americans are not a monolith. Native Americans represent literally hundreds of different communities, different tribal nations, and in some cases, these nations had differences with one another. In some cases, those differences resulted in war. And I'm sure in some cases, people were killed on both sides. But pre-contact Indigenous warfare is nothing like what took place after 1492. Okay, now let's compare this to the industrialized invasion backed up by cannons, smallpox, papal bulls declaring Christians to have the right to take the land, the right to destroy the people on the land, claiming that the people who lived on the Western Hemisphere were subhuman. This is altogether different than what you see in these pre-invasion societies in terms of conflict, in terms of warfare. Again, yes, Native Americans fought with one another. People had disagreements. People fought over hunting territories. People fought to protect their homelands and their borders. But what we see with settler colonialism and the process of colonization, which starts in 1492, is a process of elimination, a process of genocide. We're talking about millions of people who lose their life in this process. And this whole structure, right, of colonization is meant to eliminate indigenous people, at least to eliminate their culture, maybe turn them into slaves and workers, as you would see in the plantations in the Caribbean and some of your, what would become your South American countries. But the whole point was to eliminate indigenous cultures, was to acquire the land, acquire the resources, and become the permanent residents of this territory. I think what many people have been taught, primarily through the education system, is that European explorers were just that. They were exploring. They were curious about the world. But the reality is these were people who were backed by empires. They were looking for resources and new lands to exploit, for territories that they could acquire, that they could acquire wealth, whether it be gold or silver, or in some cases, human beings to work as slave labor. So we're not simply talking about curious people who are out there on this adventure. We're talking about empire building. And so when people arrive here in 1492, there's a clear intent to dominate the people and to take over the lands, certainly originally the resources. And that is something that I don't think most people quite understand. Europeans did not come here just looking to make friends. They were not simply explorers. They were colonizers. They were looking to conquer new lands and new territories. And they were looking to remove people, to force people to work on plantations, and to bring home resources to their empires. All right, so let's talk about the consequences of this invasion that happens in 1492. Some 90% of the indigenous population in North and South America, including the Caribbean, and we're talking about over 100 million people. 90% of those people were killed during the process of colonization. In some cases, entire communities were wiped out. This is both due to warfare, forced labor, massacres, and of course, European diseases that were introduced after contact. And I don't think people quite understand the gravity of this demographic disaster. It is the largest human demographic disaster in history. And never before have we ever seen this type of death on this scale. And of course, the invasion, the process of colonization, it's backed up immediately. It has a legal intent behind it, starting with the doctrine of discovery, which gave the so-called divine right to seize non-Christian lands over to European powers. These ideas and ideologies of manifest destiny, that it's the right of the civilized man to conquer uncivilized territories and take those territories over because, of course, the indigenous population isn't doing anything with them, which is completely false. Again, this is empire and settler colonial logic. The 1830 Indian Removal Act, which is basically an act of genocide and ethnic cleansing, clearing tens of thousands of indigenous communities living east of the Mississippi and moving those communities west of the Mississippi to what they refer to as Indian country, which is present-day Oklahoma. All of that is most certainly, at the very least, ethnic cleansing, and some might even argue it's an act of genocide. And then, of course, the massacres of indigenous communities. There are literally countless massacres. I live here in the state of California, and I've been doing a lot of research about the colonization of California, starting with the Spanish, and then, of course, when Europeans from the East Coast arrive here, when California becomes a state. And easily you can demonstrate that acts of genocide backed up by the state were committed here in California. And it's a pretty brutal history. And of course, there is an economic point of this. The idea is empire building. That's the whole logic behind settler colonialism, is empire building for the purpose of dominating economically speaking. And so acquiring new lands, new territories, in some cases forcing the indigenous population to work as slave labor or cheap labor. It really doesn't matter. The whole intent of this process of colonization and later settler colonialism, it's all about erasing the indigenous population and taking over the land. Now, it's not always about physically eliminating the population, because in some cases you need workers, you need people to work on the land. And so initially, like in the Caribbean and ancient Mexico, during colonial times, the Spanish attempted not simply to colonize and to eliminate the indigenous population, but the colonization process also included taking the people who survived the initial invasion and forcing those people to work on plantations and basically to become slave labor. So what you're seeing after 1492 is the primitive accumulation of wealth by European empires. This leads to the birth of modern day capitalism. It contributes to the Renaissance period, eventually the Enlightenment period, and then of course industrialization. So all this wealth is being extracted from Native America, and it's being taken back to Europe to uplift these European empires. And they go through these radical socioeconomic changes back in Europe. And of course, their societies begin to rise and indigenous societies begin to fall. And this is all due to this process of colonization and genocide. And I don't think people quite understand this because we don't teach this in our history classes. People have no understanding of the capitalistic system and how it came to be. And I would argue that without indigenous people, without their resources, without their land, capitalism simply doesn't happen, not in the way that it did anyway. So you can't compare the process of elimination, the theft of indigenous land, the destruction of indigenous life, and we're talking about some 90% of the indigenous population being destroyed, to go along with the exploitation that you see with the birth of modern capitalism, to pre-contact indigenous warfare. Again, it's a false equivalency. Okay, so let's talk about settler colonialism as a structure, not as an event, not as something that happened a long time ago, but as a system, as a structure that starts in 1492 and continues to this day. Because one of the arguments that I get often in the comment section by people who don't like some of my ideas and don't like some of the content that I put out there is that, oh, you guys are living in the past, this happened years ago, you guys need to get over it, and so on. And my response is always that what started in 1492, what was set in motion over 500 years ago, we're still living with those consequences today. So settler colonialism as a structure was put into place beginning in 1492, and it continues to this day in 2025. Here in the United States, there's 574 federally recognized tribes, and there's dozens of tribes that don't have federal recognition. There's tribes, of course, south of the border, in Mexico, South America, and of course up into Canada. And these tribes here, whether it's federally recognized tribes in the United States or tribes in Mexico or further in South America, are still fighting for their land. They're fighting for their water rights. They're fighting to protect their culture, to keep their cultures alive. There has been a concerted effort, and that's the whole point of settler colonialism, is the elimination of indigenous people, the replacement of indigenous people with a settler population, a complete restructuring of the values and the ideologies of indigenous peoples, connection to the land, connection to community, your elders. There's a direct attack on these ideologies and values that are embedded in indigenous communities to make way for this new system of control, this settler colonial system. Native Americans had children stripped away in the boarding school system. Literally tens of thousands of Native American children were taken from their family, kidnapped from their families, and sent to boarding schools where they were brainwashed to believe that their culture was worthless. Some of these kids never made it back home. The death rate was very high in many of these boarding schools. There were plans that were put into place to remove Indian children from their homes and have them adopted into white families. This is part of the civilization assimilation process, taking the savage-born infant from their uncivilized culture and bringing them to civilization. And of course, that's why you have the Indian Child Welfare Act, which was passed in the late 1970s. And of course, Native Americans are still fighting to protect their homelands from extraction. Resource extraction is a big problem. The fight at Oak Flat, Line 3, Bear Ears. Corporations treat these treaty lands as these sacrifice zones. And Native Americans are in these real fights to protect their homelands from resource extraction. And what a lot of people don't understand is that the current culture, value system, ideologies does not have a direct connection to the land. Indigenous cultures are directly tied to the land. Their culture, their language, their spirituality, and their homelands are all interrelated. You cannot separate them. And of course, the MMIW crisis, the missing and murdered Indigenous women's crisis, has been a problem really since 1492. And there's all kinds of jurisdictional issues that have been created by the settler colonial legal system. And all of these problems are not problems that happened 100 years ago and somehow they're now in the past. These are issues that Native people are dealing with here today, 1482. High poverty rates, some of the highest suicide rates, one of the lowest life expectancy rates here in the United States. So this is all a result of the system of colonialism, the structure of settler colonialism, which was set in motion in 1492. And this attack on Indigenous life, this attack on Indigenous values is not something that happened, again, 200, 300 years ago, 500 years ago. And we're all just sitting here dwelling on what happened way back in the day. And so when Christopher Columbus is being celebrated every October, I always talk to people about that holiday. And what I let them know, it's not that I am somehow against some individual, right? The individual is irrelevant. It's what he stood for and what he sets in motion. So Christopher Columbus stood for empire building and imperialism, and he sets in motion this horrible process of colonization that we're still living with here in 2025. And that's what I try to explain to people, because people will often tell me, like, why are you so worried about some person that lived over 500 years ago? And I tell people it's not what happened 500 years ago. It's what started 500 years ago and what continues to this day. So this comment, quit living in the past, is a very common tactic to turn people who have been victimized, people who have been oppressed and marginalized into the problem. This is classic gaslighting and psychological warfare. And it's part of the psychology of settler colonialism. Settler colonialism not only colonizes those who come from the land, the indigenous people on the land are not only colonized through boarding school systems, through land theft, through broken treaties, and all the history that I just mentioned, but the settlers are also living with these colonized ideas as well. This idea that indigenous people are somehow a thing of the past and are too concerned about what happened 500 years ago. And they just need to move on with their lives. And if you could only see that the American system or these colonial systems are good for all of us, again, it's just classic settler colonial, psychological warfare, settler colonial gaslighting. So let's have a little reality check here. Colonization is built into the social fabric of our country. And we see it in every aspect of the political system. We see it in the industrial prison complex. We see it in policing. We see it in our education system. We see it in our economy. Everything about settler colonialism is about eliminating Indigenous history, Indigenous culture, Indigenous values and ideologies. And that is the reality that Indigenous people are living with each and every day. And you cannot compare, again, the conflicts, the intertribal wars that took place to over 500 years of colonial violence, 500 years of land theft, 500 years of resource extraction, 500 years of this attempt to eliminate Indigenous peoples. All right, so let's talk a little bit about what accountability looks like. And this part of the show is more for the allies of Indigenous peoples and Indigenous communities. And one of the first pieces of advice I like to give anybody who wants to learn more is to educate yourself about the structure of settler colonialism. It's not enough to learn about history. You have to learn about this system of oppression that has been put into place. And I know there's a lot of folks out there who know a lot of the history, but there's more to it than simply learning the history. We have to educate ourselves about how this system continues to oppress and marginalize Indigenous communities. And you could start with learning about the treaties that were broken. There's, I believe, 371 treaties that were signed and ratified by the federal government. These are ratified by Congress, and there's some 400 treaties that were never ratified, including 18 treaties here in the state of California that were kept secret for nearly 100 years because the federal government in the state of California felt that these treaties gave away too much to the Indigenous people of California. And we also have to learn about land back initiatives. Native Americans are looking to acquire, I should say, reacquire lands that were illegally confiscated. And so we have to support the land back movement. The land back movement has nothing to do with forcing anybody off their land. It has nothing to do with sending people back to Europe or any crazy idea that may have been put out there. Really, it's about taking lands, whether it be public lands or lands that were just outright stolen, treaties that were outright broken, taking those lands and putting them back in the hands of Indigenous people who are best served to be the caretakers of those territories. And the third part of this is supporting the sovereignty of Indigenous communities, recognizing tribal jurisdiction over their resources, over their lands, and of course, over their children. And that's something that I don't think most Americans know much about. They don't know anything about tribal sovereignty. They don't know anything about the nationhood status of the 574 tribes here in the United States. And that's also a really good place to start. And of course, just education and replacing this empire mythology, empire building type of mindset that we've been indoctrinated to believe in. And I'm not just talking about settlers, I'm talking about settlers and Indigenous people, because Native people have been educated in the same public school systems as settlers have been educated in. And we have to deal with the settler mythology piece by piece, and we have to begin to educate ourselves and be open to learning, and in some cases to unlearning a way of thinking. And that's really important, I think, for all of us, especially, though, Indigenous allies. And, of course, following Indigenous leaders who are fighting for climate justice and who are speaking up about the issues that are affecting their homelands. We need to listen and we need to support those leaders. All right, so this is a challenge to all of my listeners. We have to work, all of us have to work to challenge and dismantle these systems of oppression. We need to do more than just simply learn about the past. Reading books is fine, but we have to take that knowledge and we have to put it into practice in terms of the way that we live our life. We have to support Indigenous voices, amplify Indigenous voices, and push for policy changes, especially policies that we know are meant to destroy Indigenous sovereignty. We need to be supportive of the land back movement and be aware that Indigenous communities are fighting each and every day to keep their culture alive, to protect their children, to protect their resources, to protect the land. And I think what benefits all of us when Indigenous communities are allowed to live freely on the land, how that benefits everybody is that we promote ideologies that are centered around community, protecting the environment, having a connection and a love for the land. And that is good for all human beings. And so there is a fight that started in 1492 that continues to this day. And it's really a struggle and a fight between different ideologies. One centered around empire building, this idea that if I'm stronger than you and I could conquer you, well, that's just the way it is. That's the way that human societies have always been. And of course, the way of justice, right? The way of being a human being, being somebody who's connected to a community, somebody who has a culture, and protecting those in your community, protecting the land, taking care of our elders, all the things that are good about human beings. And the things that, of course, human beings fail miserably at, and trust me, there's a lot of bad behavior out there, and there's a lot of things that human beings can do that make me question our humanity, and acts of genocide is one of them. But we also have the ability to love and to be compassionate, to be empathetic, to be caring of the biosphere and caring of elders, and thinking about our community and how we can live our lives in a way that is sustainable. And those are the things that we need to support. We need to reject any type of empire logic, any type of nonsense that, well, if you're strong enough and you have the ability to dominate others, that makes it okay, because that is morally twisted and evil. All right, y'all. So you made it to the end of the show, and I just want to say I appreciate each and every one of you who supports the work that I do. Please leave a comment in the comment section. If you're watching this on YouTube, please subscribe to Dr. B Teaches. You can follow me on Instagram. My handle is 7gen Podcast. The podcast, 7 Generation Podcast, streams on all major platforms. I'm also on TikTok. I do a lot of short form content there. My handle is Merciless Savages, and I have a small but growing community on Patreon. So you can become a Patreon and support the work that I do. Just search Dr. B Teaches, and you can find me on Patreon if you want to support my work there. But I do appreciate all of you, and I just encourage you all to educate yourself, take that education, and put it into action. All right, y'all, this is Dr. B. Till next time.